Hello, everyone, and welcome to our topic for today, sports and socialization. Today, we're going to be talking about how sport is used as a cultural tool to develop people and teach them about how they should function in a particular society. So, to start off, we want to talk about a brief definition of socialization, what it is, what it looks like. And the important thing for us to know is that socialization is what we call an active process. And we'll expand a little bit more on what this means in a minute. But essentially, it is a process that everybody participates in that teaches them how to behave in social environments. And this occurs as we interact with others and familiarize ourselves with the social worlds we are a part of. So, any group that you're a member of, you're constantly engaging in the socialization process. And through socialization, we learn things like norms and values. Norms are just the ways that we are expected to behave in different environments, and values, obviously, the things that we care about or that we value or that we believe to be right and wrong. And so when we say socialization is an active process, we're talking about the fact that people need to engage in it as well as learn from it. So whenever you are engaging in socialization, you are socializing with people and they are socializing with you, and it is constant. So you engage in socialization by forming social relationships, being influenced by those relationships, and then influencing others within that relationship. And so we typically use what we call the interactionist model to talk about socialization. And this is one of our more modern approaches. We'll talk about a couple others here today as well, but we generally consider socialization to be an active process through the interactionist lens. And the interactionist model says essentially, when we're talking about sports specifically, that sports are created and maintained through social interaction, that people interact with sport specifically so that it can be used as a tool to socialize them. And if you think about probably some of your experiences growing up and participating in sport, you played sports that taught you lessons that your parents and society in general valued. And so with that in mind, sports are studied in terms of how they create and give meaning to people. Okay, and so we talked about this several times already this semester, but sport is a tool of the culture that it exists within to develop and teach people values and norms. So some different examples of some interactionist uh, um, environments would be any type of relationship that you have with parents, teachers, peers, coaches, anybody who you have a direct relationship with. These people all teach you norms about things like safety, things like risk taking, what types of behaviors are expected of you in given environments, right? Think about whenever you walk into a classroom, you roughly know what is expected of you. You're supposed to go and sit in a desk. The teacher is going to stand in front. They're going to teach you, and that's how you generally function in that environment. It's very rare that you would function differently in any environment. There might be some variations in terms of desk layouts and things like that, but for the most part, you walk into a classroom for the first time, you generally know what to expect. Um, in the sport environment, we might be, looking to give meaning to, general bumps and bruises. Things like this is hard work. Hard work can sometimes be painful, and so you learn from that and you grow from it. So with that in mind, a child that plays sports may define pain as a normal part of playing sports and injuries as a symbol of a commitment to a team. So, you think about if you played football or basketball or any of these sports growing up and you got hurt, your coach might have said something to the effect of there's a difference between hurt and being injured. And if you're hurt, you can still play. If you're injured, it means you can't play. And being hurt and playing is a sign of toughness, and it's a badge of honor amongst athletes. And so these are good examples that we're trying to draw from that show us what the individual society values. So looking at some more traditional research on sports socialization, We're talking about the internalization model. So the interactionist model is the more modern approach that focuses on the active process of socialization. The internalization model um, is much more passive. We'll talk about that in a second. But it assumes that social learning occurs as people internalize rules of society by growing up in their families, attending school, interacting with peers, and receiving messages through social media. In other words, unlike the interactionist model, where you sort of develop an understanding of how you're supposed to behave through trial and error, right? You interact with another person, and that person sort of responds in some way, and you both learn how you're going to interact, right? When you are an athlete and you are, you know, trying to learn a new play or some form of movement that you're trying to practice over and over again, your coach might coach it a specific way. You try to learn it, you try to do it. Maybe it didn't work out the right way the first time. Your coach then tries to correct you, and over time, you learn the movement and how you're supposed to uh, um, be performing that individual action within the sport. But the coach also learns how to coach you. And so that is an active process on both ends where you're both being socialized on how you're supposed to interact with each other. The internalization model says that that doesn't happen. What actually happens is that the coach tells you what you're supposed to do, and then you learn how to do it. And so when we look at the internalization model, it's a much more passive process than the interactionist model. And that's kind of actually one of the big issues. It's why the internalization model is becoming less popular, is because it sort of implies that uh, socialization occurs passively or automatically. That when people just sort of grow up in an environment, they just learn how to behave, and that's not really how it works. People practice how to behave and then get better at it. And so it produces conflicting and inconsistent findings regarding like why people play sports, why people stop playing sports, what happens as they play sports. Those types of things are very important when we're talking about the role that sport plays in society. If we look at the internalization model further, it consistently identifies three major things. One, general patterns in sport participation throughout the life. And so we know that people participate in sport early in life and then generally fall off unless they're pursuing like high level athletic participation. Maybe that's professional sport, maybe that's major amateur sport like Olympics, but something that is very high achieving. Unless you're in that very small group of people, you are more than likely going to be participating in sport very early in life, and then slowly and gradually you and your peers drop off over time. Typically, the major drop off is going to be after high school, right? Because most people stop participating in organized sport typically after high school. They might do some recreational sport after that, but a lot of people, once they have organized athletics removed from their lives, don't want to participate in sport any further. We also can identify barriers that prevent or discourage people from playing. So there are financial barriers, there are locational barriers, all sorts of barriers that kind of illustrate that there is a societal aspect to being able to participate in sport, and there's a societal aspect to which sports are most popular in different environments. So if you think about like why is soccer the number one sport in the world? Soccer is the number one sport in the world because it's the cheapest sport to play. Anybody can play it. All you need is a ball and some friends. And as long as you have a ball and some friends, you can play soccer. And so anywhere in the world, there are kids playing soccer all in all sorts of different environments, rural communities, major cities, suburban areas, wealthy communities, poorer communities. There are people who can play soccer. And so that is why soccer has managed to captivate the world stage, where other sports, like for instance, American football, is very expensive to play. And so it's a little bit more difficult to capture the globe. We also notice things like connections between sport participation and educational achievement. Students who participate in sports generally perform better in school, and there's a lot of different reasons for this. It's important. Physical activity is very important to ensuring that the mind is stimulated and that students are able to focus on their learning when they're in class. It's also a great tool in American culture because we have things like academic eligibility. So when you perform poorly in school, you don't get to play your sports. That's a pretty significant punishment for a lot of kids. So it benefits them to have that as a a tool that illustrates these things are both important, and if you're not performing in one, you don't get to do the other. Sexual behavior and pregnancy rates, these decrease with sport participation because generally speaking, sexual behavior and pregnancy rates are correlated with the amount of free time that people have. And so when they are engaged in sport activity, they're more likely to kind of avoid those things because they have less sort of free kind of unaccounted for time in their schedules. Health and wellness, obvious benefits, right? When you're participating in sports, you're more than likely going to be doing some form of athletic activity that is beneficial to you. And then self-esteem. You perform well in sports, you feel better about yourself. So there are things the internalization model has taught us about the reasons why people participate in sport and some of the general benefits that they get from it. The only thing about the internalization model that has been sort of phased out is the understanding of how and why those connections are important. Where do they come from and how do they develop? But there are some things that the internalization model has showed us about sports that help establish its value in society. So looking at participation patterns specifically, it's dependent on three main factors. One, a person's skill, abilities, characteristics, and resources. So we talked about, right, that after high school, participation drops off pretty dramatically. That is because a person's skill level has prevented them from being able to participate in organized sports at the collegiate or professional levels. And so typically at the high school level, right, anybody can do this. They just sign up for the team. Sometimes they have to pay a fee. Sometimes they don't even need to do that. But once you get up to the college and professional levels, there's an element of skill that is a barrier for a lot of people. And then again, financial resources we talked about as well. It also has some sort of effect on the significant people in your life has an effect on the types of participation that you're engaged in. So if you had a parent who played basketball, odds are pretty good that you're going to play basketball. I've done research with people focusing on tennis training and tennis development. The overwhelming majority of kids who grow up in tennis culture, high level, high performing tennis culture in America, have parents who participated in tennis at the collegiate or professional levels. And so if you have parents, you have friends who are doing something, you want to do it too. You want to connect with those people. And so you're willing to do that. And then availability of opportunities, again, that's why soccer is the number one sport in the world. Anybody can do it anywhere. Over time, becoming and staying involved in sports, okay, past research indicates that becoming and staying involved in sport is heavily influenced by self-reflection. So in other words, when you are participating in sport, you reflect on that experience. Did you enjoy it? Did you not? If you didn't enjoy it, you stop playing. If you did, you keep going. Social supportive resources. Do you have the money to continue doing this? Do you have the social support? If you're trying to play baseball and you're on a team that travels a lot, if your parents aren't able to drive you around when you're 11 years old and you can't travel yet, and you don't have anybody on the team who can do it, that's a lack of social support. You now no longer have the ability to do those things. Social acceptance. You may have known people who participated in a sport and were criticized for it, or maybe the sport itself was criticized. That might reduce interest in participation for that individual or just individuals in general. I had a friend in high school who decided to join the cheerleading squad. He stopped playing football. He wasn't very good at it and decided to go join the cheerleading squad. He was criticized for that by his friends. He was bullied by a lot of people because he was doing something that was considered feminine when it was just a sport that he really enjoyed doing. And he actually got a college scholarship for it. So it was a really beneficial thing for him to be able to do that while social acceptance was still relatively low. Cultural images and messages. What are the connections involving this sport? What are the general media? What is the general media analysis of this sport? What does it look like? Those types of things could be pretty significant in terms of affecting participation. And then the meanings attached to certain demographic characteristics in sport participation. So in other words, what do other people think about the people who play the sport? Changing and ending sport participation is one of the most interesting things that we can study about cultures, because once people eventually sort of grow up and grow out of sports, it oftentimes requires a little bit of a transition and sort of relearning some of the things that you learned in sports and how to apply them to the real world. And that's because sport is usually such a huge part of people's lives when they're young. It is a huge part of their socialization. It's a huge part of the friend groups that they form and the meaningful relationships that they have. And so dropping out is a major part of somebody's life. Generally speaking, people don't drop ties to a sport for forever. So more than likely, many of you have some sport that you cared about the most, or a couple of sports that you cared about the most. And those are now the sports, if you're not still participating in them, that you follow, that you become either a fan of. Sometimes some of you may be interested in coaching, being referees, having some sort of organizational affiliation. But generally speaking, people don't end their relationship forever. Sometimes that can just mean, if they played football growing up, sometimes that just means on Saturdays and Sundays they watch football. Um, and sometimes it's a little bit more elaborate than that. But people have a very hard time ending their relationship entirely with sport. It's a major, no matter what, it's a major transition in your life. So when you stop playing sports, if you've ever stopped playing sports, especially organized sport, you understand what we're talking about here. Um, it's a major transition in your life. It can be difficult to process that. It's not always due to negative experiences dropping out. Sometimes it's just, again, a skill related issue. Maybe if you were a 5'6" and 170-pound linebacker in high school, the odds of you playing football in college are pretty low. Right? It's just a physical thing, and even if you had a lot of fun, it doesn't mean you necessarily, um, uh, you wanted to stop playing. It can just be that you had some other barrier that prevented you from participating further. But above all else, the thing that really concerns us is that dropping out can cause some major issues for some people. So one way is that you can have your identity totally grounded in sports. Ryan Leaf was a great example of this, where he really struggled once his college football career ended, and then he went to the NFL, and his identity was, I'm a great quarterback. And then he got to the NFL, and it kind of felt like he wasn't a great quarterback anymore. And once that happened, he started to look to other sources to sort of reconnect with himself and his identity. And he found that in drugs and alcohol consumption, and it had a significantly negative effect on his life. Another example that we might have would be someone like Marcus Dupree, who lacked social and material resources. So Marcus Dupree had, a pretty rough life growing up. It's one of the reasons why he wanted to declare for the NFL draft so early. And he didn't have a lot of financial resources. So once he got out of college and he didn't have that insulation, that protection of that environment, and he got out on his own when he was really not emotionally or mentally ready yet, he now no longer had the social resources of being inside of a college football program and being insulated, but he also didn't have the material resources because he was playing in a non major professional league, and so he didn't have a ton of money that he could fall back on either. And so these are both good examples of you know people who really struggled with that transition and what that looks like and why. It also, in past research, also indicates that changing or ending sport participation can have some potentially negative effects, and is just a general transition period for a lot of people. Number one, identity or development issues, that's burnout. So people have a really, really hard time with sort of reformulating or understanding who they are when they stop participating in sport, and especially if it happens during their participation in the sport. So if you are playing your sport and you love it, and then all of a sudden you sort of hit a burnout phase where you're just kind of mentally and emotionally done with it, that's very tough. Yeah, it requires you to sort of self-reflect on your experiences, and can even make it seem like this was a negative experience, even if it was generally positive. In the moment, it's going to feel like it was negative. It obviously also results in you need to accept the end. Sometimes it means you need to go get a job, right? I mean, there's especially right now in college athletics, because we have the COVID-19 pandemic year. There are still a lot of athletes who have a ton of eligibility. There's a big joke now that you need to accept the end and go get a job. Um, you know, there's a tight end at the University of Miami who's got 9 years of eligibility that he's used in college athletics. Those types of stories, people like to make fun of that, but it's very hard for people to let go of their college experience and participating in athletics, because it's a huge part of their lives, especially when you get up to the college level and above. Your life can very often feel like it revolves around sports. And so it is a major life transition. It is very difficult for people to start that process. And ultimately, no matter what, it's going to lead to a major period of self-reflection. So what happens while we play? What are some things that we learn? Well, one of the first things that we learn is that sports builds character. And so what does that mean? It means that we understand that sports is going to teach us some sort of life lesson, whatever that might be. Typically, it's like hard work, teamwork, resilience. Okay, that's usually what we mean by character. Um, this is believed in many cultures. This is not America. This is not just an American belief. This is all over the world. This is part of the reason why sports fits in different environments. When we talk about sports having a similar role as religion in a lot of places, it's because we use religion to teach people how to be good people. We use sports the same way. We use sports as a development tool to teach our children how to be good people. Um, and very often this is assumed to be automatic, and this is often very often tied to the belief in the great sport myth. We talked about that, right? The idea that anything tied to sports is automatically good. We obviously know that that is not always the case. But we very often, when we're talking about socialization, believe that, hey, our kid is playing baseball. That means they're going to learn a bunch of great lessons about teamwork and resilience and being a good person. This is automatic, and baseball is going to teach them how to do that no matter what. And so this is one of the things that we need to think about as we are, choosing what sports we participate in and what we care about when we're putting young people in organized sport. So with that in mind, it's important that we understand some of those factors that are overlooked on sports building character. So sport participation offers diverse experiences. Both of them are positive and negative, right? If you had a very positive coach who focused on, hey, we're gonna, worry about you as a person first, and then, sports success is secondary. That's a very positive experience. We'll talk about youth sport development in the next chapter and why that is the case. But some coaches have a very success focused metric that we're looking at the youth level, and that can have very negative long-term impact. So it really depends on the environment that you're in. The selection process in organized sports favor some characteristics over others. So there are some sports that we generally favor in comparison to others. Those are typically things like team sports. We value teamwork. We care about teamwork. We care about learning how to work with others. We care less about the individual sports, even though the individual sports have good lessons that they teach as well. We give meanings to sport experiences, and these vary by athletes. Lessons learned and lessons applied very widely. Some athletes learn a ton from their sport participation. Some learn nothing at all. Okay, so we have to understand that just because you are participating in sports doesn't mean that you're necessarily getting anything out of it. Those meanings of those experiences change over time. If you think about the youth level, very common to think, okay, this is 5, 6 year olds. Let's teach them life lessons. Okay, as they get older, you're focused more on development and being successful at a high level, right? So the meanings of those experiences are changing. We're focused on different things, and we're caring about different things. And so what those athletes are getting out of that experience is going to pretty dramatically change over time. Social relationships mediate sport experiences and meanings given to them. Okay, so if you have really good relationships with your teammates, that sport experience is going to be even better. Okay, if you have really good relationships with your coaches, that sport experience is going to be significantly better, regardless of your success. If you have very poor relationships with those people, but you're still successful, you might have a very different experience with what that success looks like and what it's teaching you about success and what it takes to be successful. The socialization that occurs in sports may also occur in other activities. There are other places where you can learn teamwork. There are other places where you can learn hard work. There are other places where you can learn resilience. All of these things are things that you learn through sports, but they are not exclusive to sports. And finally, sport participation provides positive socialization effects when it provides one, opportunities to explore and develop non-sport identities. So when young people are afforded the opportunity to explore who they are beyond the sport space, that's really valuable. Knowledge building experiences that go beyond the locker room and the playing field. In other words, when people are learning through sports about other things, that can be really helpful. New relationships with people who are not connected with sports. So when you allow young people to explore their relationships out of the sports space, it makes the transition easier. One of the things that's really difficult when you stop playing sports is if you don't have really social connections outside of it, it now feels like you've sort of lost a huge part of who you are, and that significantly affects your sense of identity. Explicit examples of how lessons learned in sports can be applied in non-sport situations. If you make sure to teach people, hey, this is how life is going to be, this is what you're going to learn about in this environment, and this is how you can transfer outside of it, it makes that transition a little bit easier. And then opportunities to develop and display competence in non-sport activities and become linked with mentors and advocates in the process. This is one of the things that we hear from young people a lot when they're participating in sport at the youth level and even into the intercollegiate level, is that the resources provided them to connect with people outside of sport activities are very limited. That they are essentially told that you have to do X, Y, and Z all the time, all day, every day, and that you're not allowed to really have meaningful social relationships outside of this. And your meaningful connections with mentors are not facilitated. And so all of your mentors, all of your social relationships are tied to the sport. And indeed, that is one of the things that is enforced at the professional level. There are tons of intercollegiate athletes who have been criticized by professional organizations during the sort of evaluation process as they're going into the professional level because they have too many connections outside of the sport. They want you to be tied to the sport and dependent on it. That's the key. So when we're talking about sport building character, when we're developing individuals who are very dependent on the sport for their sense of identity and who they are, that can actually be very damaging. So if we're focusing on building character, then we need to focus on making sure that they are holistic people independent of the sport process. But that's all I've got for y'all today. Thank you for watching, and I will see y'all next time.